Our situation, as it now appeared, was scarcely less dreadful than when we had conceived ourselves entombed forever. We saw now before us no prospect but that of being put to death by the savages, or of dragging out a miserable existence in captivity among them. We might, to be sure, conceal ourselves for a time from their observation as among the fastnesses of the hills, and as a final resort in the chasm from which we had just issued, but we must either perish in the long polar winter through cold and famine, or be ultimately discovered in our efforts to obtain relief. The whole country around us seemed to be swarming with savages, crowds of whom we now perceived had come over from the islands to the southward on flat rafts, doubtless with a view of lending their aid in the capture and plunder of the Jane. The vessel still lay calmly at anchor in the bay, those on board being apparently quite unconscious of any danger awaiting them. How we longed at that moment to be with them, either to aid in effecting their escape or to perish with them in attempting a defense. We saw no chance even of warning them of either danger without bringing immediate destruction upon our own heads, with a remote hope of benefit to them. A pistol fired might suffice to apprise them that something wrong had occurred, but the report could not possibly inform them that their only prospect of safety lay in getting out of the harbor forthwith. It could not tell them that no principles of honor now bound them to remain, that their companions were no longer among the living. Upon hearing the discharge, they could not be more thoroughly prepared to meet the foe, who were now getting ready to attack, than they already were, and always had been. No good, therefore, and infinite harm would result from our firing, and after mature deliberation, we forbore. Our next thought was to attempt to rush toward the vessel to seize one of the 4 canoes which lay at the head of the bay, and endeavor to force a passage on board. But the utter impossibility of succeeding in this desperate task soon became evident. The country, as I said before, was literally swarming with natives, skulking among the bushes and recesses of the hills so as not to be observed from the schooner. In our immediate vicinity especially, and blockading the sole path by which we could hope to attain the shore at the proper point, were stationed the whole party of the black-skinned warriors, with 2 wit at their head, and apparently only waiting for some reinforcement to commence his onset upon the Jane. The canoes, too, which lay at the head of the bay, were manned with savages, unarmed, it is true, but who undoubtedly had arms within reach. We were forced, therefore, however unwillingly, to remain in our place of concealment, mere spectators of the conflict which presently ensued. In about half an hour we saw some 60 or 70 rafts or flatboats, with outriggers, filled with savages, and coming round the south bight of the harbor. They appeared to have no arms except short clubs and stones which lay in the bottom of the rafts. Immediately afterward, another detachment, still larger, approached in an opposite direction with similar weapons. The 4 canoes, too, were now quickly filled with natives, starting up from the bushes at the head of the bay, and put off swiftly to join the other parties. Thus, in less time than I have taken to tell it, and as if by magic, the Jane saw herself surrounded by an immense multitude of desperadoes, evidently bent upon capturing her at all hazards. That they would succeed in so doing could not be doubted for an instant. The 6 men left in the vessel, however resolutely they might engage in her defense, were altogether unequal to the proper management of the guns, or in any manner to sustain a contest at such odds. I could hardly imagine that they would make resistance at all, but in this this was deceived, for presently I saw them get springs upon the cable and bring the vessel's starboard broadside to bear upon the canoes, which by this time were within pistol range, the rafts being nearly a quarter of a mile to windward. Owing to some cause unknown, but probably to the agitation of our poor friends at seeing themselves in so hopeless a situation, the discharge was an entire failure. Not a canoe was hit or a single savage injured, the shots striking short and ricocheting over their heads. The only effect it produced upon them was astonishment at the unexpected report and smoke, which was so excessive that for some moments I almost thought they would abandon their design entirely and return to the shore. And this they would most likely have done had our men followed up their broadside by a discharge of small arms, in which, as the canoes were now so near at hand, they could not have failed in so doing some execution, sufficient at least to deter this party from a farther advance until they could have given the rafts also a broadside. But in place of this, they left the canoe party to recover from their panic, and by looking about them to see no injury that had been sustained, while they flew to the larboard to get ready for the rafts. The discharge to larboard produced the most terrible effect. The star and double-headed shot of the large guns cut 7 or 8 of the rafts completely asunder, and killed perhaps 30 or 40 savages outright, while 100 of them at least were thrown into the water. The most of them dreadfully wounded. The remainder, frightened out of their senses, commenced at once a precipitate retreat. Not even waiting to pick up their maimed companions, who were swimming about in every direction, screaming and yelling for aid. This great success, however, came too late for the salvation of our devoted people. The canoe party were already on board the schooner to the number of more than 150, the most of them having succeeded in scrambling up the chains and up over the boarding nettings, even before the matches had been applied to their larboard guns. Nothing now could withstand their brute rage. Our men were borne down at once, overwhelmed, trodden underfoot, and absolutely torn to pieces in an instant. Seeing this, the savages on the rafts got the better of their fears and came up in shoals to the plunder. In 5 minutes the Jane was a pitiable scene, indeed, of havoc and tumultuous outrage. The decks were split open and ripped up, the cordage, sails, and everything movable on deck demolished as if by magic. While by dint of pushing at the stern, towing with the canoes, and hauling at the sides, as they swam in thousands around the vessels, the wretches finally forced her on shore, the cable having been slipped, and delivered her over to the good offices of Too-Wit, who during the whole of the engagement had maintained, like a skillful general, his post of security and reconnaissance among the hills. But now that the victory was completed to his satisfaction, condescended to scamper down with his warriors of the black skin, and become a partaker in the spoils. Too-Wit's descent left us at liberty to quit our hiding place and reconnoiter the hill in the vicinity of the chasm. At about 50 yards at the mouth of it, we saw a small spring of water, at which we slaked the burning thirst that now consumed us. Not far from the spring, we discovered several of the filbert bushes which I mentioned before. Upon tasting the nuts, we found them palatable, and very nearly resembling in flavor the common English filbert. We collected our hats full immediately, deposited them within the ravine, and returned for more. Whilst we were busily employed in gathering these, the rustling in the bushes alarmed us, and we were upon the point of stealing back to our covert, when a large black bird of the bittern species strugglingly and slowly arose above the shrubs. I was so much startled I could do nothing, but Peters, had sufficient presence of mind to run up before it could make its escape and seize it by the neck. Its struggles and screams were tremendous, and we had thoughts of letting it go, lest the noise should alarm some of the savages who might still be lurking in the neighborhood. A stab with a bowie knife, however, at length brought it to the ground, and we dragged it into the ravine. Congratulating ourselves that, at all events, we had thus obtained a supply of food enough to last us for a week. We now went out again to look about us, and ventures a considerable distance down from the southern declivity of the hill, but met with nothing else which could serve us for food. We therefore collected a quantity of dry wood and returned, seeing one of the two large parties of the natives on their way to the village, laden with the plunder of the vessel, and who, we were apprehensive, might discover us in passing beneath the hill. Our next care was to render our place of concealment as secure as possible, and with this object we arranged some brushwood over the aperture which I have before spoken of as the one through which we saw the patch of blue sky. On reaching the platform from the interior of the chasm, we had only left a very small opening, just wide enough to admit one of our seeing the bay, without the risk of being discovered from below. Having done this, we congratulated ourselves upon the security of this position, and we were now completely excluded from observation, as long as we chose to remain within the ravine itself, and not venture out upon the hill. We could perceive no traces of the savages having ever been within this hollow, but indeed, when we came to reflect upon the probability of the fissure through which we had attained, it had only been just now created by the fall of the cliff opposite, and that no other way of attaining it could be perceived. We were not so much rejoiced at the thought of being secure from molestation, as fearful lest there should be absolutely no means left for us to descend. We resolved to explore the summit of the hill thoroughly when a good opportunity should offer. In the meantime, we watched the motions of the savages through our loophole. They had already made a complete wreck of the vessel and were now preparing to set her on fire. In a little while, we saw the smoke ascending in huge volumes for their main hatchway, and shortly afterward, a dense mass of flame burst up from the forecastle. The rigging masts and what remained of the sails caught immediately, and the fire spread rapidly along the decks. Still, a great many of the savages retained their stations about her, hammering with large stones, axes, and cannonballs at the bolts and other iron and copper work. On the beach, and in canoes and rafts, there were not less, altogether, than the immediate vicinity of the schooner, than 10,000 natives, besides the shoals of them who, laden with booty, were making their way inland and over to the neighboring islands. We now anticipated a catastrophe and were not disappointed. First of all, there came the smart shock, which we thought as distinctly where we were as if we had been slightly galvanized, but unattended with any visible sign of an explosion. The savages were evidently startled and paused for an instant from their labors and yellings. They were upon the point of recommencing when suddenly a mass of smoke puffed up from the decks, resembling a black and heavy thundercloud. Then, as if from its bowels arose a tall stream of vivid fire to the height, apparently of a quarter of a mile. Then there came a sudden circular expansion of the flame. Then the whole atmosphere was magically crowded in an instant with the wild chaos of wood and metal and human limbs. And lastly came the concussion in its fullest fury, which hurled us impetuously from our feet, while the hills echoed and re-echoed the tumult, and a dense shower of the minutest fragments of the ruins tumbled headlong in every direction around us. The havoc among the savages far exceeded our utmost expectation, and they had now indeed reaped the full and perfect fruits of their treachery. Perhaps 1,000 perished by the explosion, while at least an equal number were desperately mangled. The whole surface of the bay was literally strewn with the struggling and drowning wretches. And on shore, matters were even worse. They seemed utterly appalled by the suddenness and completeness of their discomfiture, and made no efforts at assisting one another. At length we observed a total change in their demeanor. From absolute stupor, they appeared about to be all at once arousing to the highest pitch of excitement and rushing wildly about, going to and fro from a certain point on the beach, with the strangest expressions of mingled horror, rage, and intense curiosity depicted on their countenances, and shouting at the top of their voices, "Takalili, Takalili." We presently saw a large body go off into the woods and into the hills, whence they returned in a short time carrying stakes of wood. These they brought to the station where the crowd was the thickest, which now separated us to afford us a view of the object of all this excitement. We perceived something white lying upon the ground, but could not immediately make out what it was. At length we saw that it was the carcass of the strange animal with the scarlet teeth and the claws, which the schooner had picked up at sea on the 18th of January. Captain Guy had had the body preserved for the purpose of stuffing the skin and taking it to England. I remember he had given some directions about it just before our making the island, and it having been brought into the cabin and stowed away into one of the lockers. It had now been thrown on shore by the explosion, but why it had occasioned so much concern among the natives, the savages, was more than we could comprehend, although they crowded around the carcass at little distance, none of them seeming willingly to approach it closely. By and by, the men with the stakes drove them into a circle around it, and no sooner was this arrangement completed that the whole of the vast assemblage rushed into the interior of the island with loud screams of "Takalili, Takalili." During the 6 or 7 days immediately following, we remained in our hiding place upon the hill, going out only occasionally, and with the greatest precaution for water and filberts. We had made a kind of penthouse on the platform, furnishing it with a bed of dry leaves and placing it with 3 large flat stones, which served us for both fireplace and table. We kindled a fire without difficulty by rubbing 2 pieces of dry wood together, one soft, the other hard. The bird we had taken in such good season provided excellent eating, although somewhat tough. It was not an oceanic fowl, but it was a species of bittern, with jet black and grisly plumage, and diminutive wings in proportion to its bulk. We afterwards saw 3 of the same kind of vicinity in the ravine, apparently seeking for the one we had captured, but as they never alighted, we had no opportunity of catching them. As long as this fowl lasted, we suffered nothing from our situation, but it was now entirely consumed. It became absolutely necessary that we should look out for provision. The filberts would not satisfy the cravings of hunger, afflicting us too with severe gripings of the bowels, and if freely indulged in, with violent headache. We had seen several large tortoises near the seashore to the eastward of the hill, and perceived that they might be easily taken if we could get at them without the observation of the natives. It was resolved, therefore, to make an attempt at descending. We commenced by going down to the southern declivity, which seemed to offer the fewest difficulties, but it had not proceeded 100 yards before, as we had anticipated from appearances on the hilltop. Our progress was entirely arrested by the branch of the gorge in which our companions had perished. We now passed along the edge of this for about a quarter of a mile when we were again stopped by a precipice of immense depth, and not being able to make our way along the brink of it, we were forced to retrace our steps by the main ravine. We now pushed over to the eastward, but with precisely similar fortune. After an hour's scramble, at the risk of breaking our necks, we discovered that we had merely descended into a vast pit of black granite, with fine dust at the bottom, and whence only the egress was by the rugged path in which we had come down. Toiling again up this path, we had now tried the northern edge of the hill. Here we were obliged to use the greatest possible caution in our maneuvers, as the least indiscretion would expose us to the full view of the savages in the village. We crawled along, therefore, on our hands and knees, and occasionally we were even forced to throw ourselves at full length, dragging our bodies along by means of the shrubbery. In this careful manner we had proceeded but a little way, when we had arrived at the chasm far deeper than any we confirmed, and found ourselves cut off entirely from access to the world below. Thoroughly exhausted by our exertions, we made the best of our way back to the platform, and throwing ourselves upon the bed of leaves, slept sweetly and soundly for some hours. For several days after this fruitless search, we were occupied in exploring every part of the summit of the hill in order to inform ourselves of its actual resources. We found that it would afford us no food, with the exception of the unwholesome filberts, and the rank species of scurvy grass which grew in a little patch of not more than 4 rods square, and would soon be exhausted. On the 15th of February, as near as I can remember, there was not a blade of this left, and the nuts were growing scarce. Our situation, therefore, could hardly be more lamentable. On the 16th we went round the walls of our prison in hopes of finding some avenue of escape, but to no purpose. We also descended the chasm in which we had been overwhelmed, with the faint expectation of discovering through this channel some opening to the main ravine. Here too we were disappointed, although we found and brought up with us a musket. On the 17th we set out with the determination of examining more thoroughly the chasm of black granite into which we had made our way in the first search. We remembered that one of the fissures at the sides of this pit had been but partially looked into. We were anxious to explore it, although with no expectation of discovering here any opening. We found no difficulty in reaching the bottom of the hollow as before. We were now sufficiently calm to survey it with some attention. It was indeed one of the most singular-looking places imaginable, and we could scarcely bring ourselves to believe it altogether the work of nature. The pit, from its eastern to its western extremity, was about 500 yards in length, and when all windings were threaded, the distance from east to west in a straight line, not being more, I should suppose, having been no means of accurate examination, than 40 or 50 yards. Upon first descending into the chasm, that is to say for 100 feet downward from the summit of the hill, the sides of the abyss bore little resemblance to each other, and apparently had no time been connected, the one surface being of the soapstone, and the other of marl, granulated with some metallic matter. The average breadth or interval between the two cliffs was probably here 60 feet, but there seemed to be no regularity of formation. Passing down, however, beyond the limit spoken of, the interval rapidly contracted, and the sides began to run parallel, although for some distance farther they were still dissimilar in their material and form of surface. Upon arriving within 50 feet of the bottom, a perfect regularity commenced. The sides were now entirely uniform in substance, in color, and in lateral direction, the material being a very black and shiny granite, and distance between the two sides at all points facing each other exactly 20 yards. The precise formation of the chasm will be best understood by means of delineation and taking her upon the spot. I had luckily with me a pocketbook and pencil, which I preserved with great care through a long series of subsequent adventure, and to which I am indebted for memoranda of many subjects which would otherwise have been crowded with from my remembrance. This figure gives the general outlines of the chasm, without minor cavities in the sides, of which there were several, each cavity having a corresponding protuberance opposite. The bottom of the gulf was covered to the depth of 3 or 4 inches with a powder almost impalpable, beneath which we found a continuation of the granite. To the right, at the lower extremity, will be noticed the appearance of a small opening. This is the fissure alluded to above, and to examine it more minutely than before was the object of our second visit. We now pushed into it with vigor, cutting away a quantity of brambles which impeded us, and removing a vast heap of sharp flints somewhat resembling arrowheads in shape. We were encouraged to persevere, however, by perceiving some little light proceeding from the farther end. We at length squeezed our way from about 30 feet, and found the aperture was a low and regularly formed arch, having a bottom of the same impalpable powder as that in the main chasm. A strong light now broke upon us, and turning a short bend, we found ourselves in another loft chamber, similar to the one we had left in every respect by longitudinal form. Its general figure is here given. The total length of this chasm, commencing at the opening A and proceeding around the curve B to the extremity D, is 550 yards. At C, we discovered a small aperture similar to the one through which we had issued from this other chasm, and this was choked up in the same manner from the brambles and a quantity of the white arrow-headed flints. We forced our way through it, finding it some about 40 feet long, emerged in a third chasm, and this, too, was precisely like the first, except in longitudinal shape, which was thus. We found the entire length of the third chasm 320 yards. At point A was an opening about 6 feet and extending 15 feet into the rock, where it terminated into a bed of marl, there being no other chasm beyond, as we expected. We were about leaving this fissure, into which very little light was admitted, when Peters called my attention to a range of singular-looking indentures into the surface of the marl, forming the termination of the cul-de-sac. With a very slight exertion of the imagination, the left, or most northern of these indentures, might have been taken for the intentional, although rude, representation of a human figure standing erect, with outstretched arm. The rest of them bore also some little resemblance to alphabetical characters, and Peters was willing, at all events, to adopt the idle opinion that they were really such. I convinced him of his error, finally, by directing his attention to the floor of the fissure, where, among the powder, we picked up, piece by piece, several flakes of the marl, which had evidently broken off by some convulsion from the surface where the indentures were found, and which had projecting points exactly fitting the indentures, thus proving them to have been the work of nature. Figure 4 presents an accurately copy of the whole. After satisfying ourselves with these singular caverns, affords no means of escape from our prison, We made our way back, dejected and dispirited, to the summit of the hill. Nothing worth mentioning occurred during the next 24 hours, except that in examining the ground to the eastward of the third chasm, we found two triangular holes of the great depths. And also with black granite sides. Into these holes we did not think it worth to attempt descending, as they had appearance of nearly natural wells without outlet. They were here each about 20 yards in circumference in their shape, as well as the relative position in regard to the third chasm. Is shown in Figure 5.